Hello, BookTube. Today I'm going to try to make the comparison of compare the two books, Steele by Harry Turtledove with It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis. Now, this is an odd coupling, and they are very, very different books, but they share similar plot beats, as they call it. Plot beats. Things that happen in the story that make you can't help but draw the comparison. So both books tell the story of the rise of a dictator in the 1930s. And there are actually several dozen books like that of the rise of dictators in the 1930s in alternate history books. What was it? The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. That's the best example other than these two. And it's understandable because in the 1930s, with the rise of Hitler and in the midst of the Great Depression, there was a lot of social anxiety going on in the United States of, will we descend into dictatorship because democracy is failing us failing us economically. And Sinclair Lewis wrote his book in 1935, and it clearly illustrates the social anxieties of that era. And every time the United States gets the scares of are we losing our liberty, sales of this book jump up. So but I won't go further into that because then I'd have to do a more deeper dive into politics. And so, Matt Mitrovich at The Alternate Historian has a video series about American dictators. In the future, there will be links in the description. Go check that out. Several of these potential alternate histories of America descending into dictatorship take place in the 1930s. So there's that. So it's like a subgenre in dystopian and alternate history books about the rise of a dictator in the 1930s in the United States. There are actually several books and several people discussing that time period. Anyway, so both books tell the story of a fictional dictator of the United States that rose to power in the 1930s. Both books are told from the perspective of one or two journalists. In Joe Steele, it's the Sullivan brothers, and in Sinclair Lewis, it's Doremus Jessup. Now, so they observe their country descend into dictatorship. And that's all there is to it in similarities between the two books. Now I will, excuse me. Originally, I was going to make a review of these two books, but several booktubers already made reviews of these books, so I thought this would be a much more interesting exercise. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to draw out some observations which I liked from these books. Sinclair Lewis. Wow, do I have a lot to say. Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. I have a lot to say about this book. First of all, you can clearly see that Sinclair Lewis was in the moment when he wrote that book. When he wrote this book. He was... I'm sure the book went through multiple edits before it was published because he was very present. He describes in vivid details, he name drops several politicians and other historic figures of the 1930s. He describes the environment. This is what teenage grandpa would have seen. My teenage grandfather would have seen in the 1930s. Because, 29... Wait, maybe... Yes, my teenage grandfather. And... So I found this book very interesting. It is a snapshot into the 1930s. You can really immerse yourself into 1930s life because the book was written in the 1930s, not researched, but written. So it's really describing. It's an eyewitness account. It's a literal photo, not literal. It's a photograph to the past in the form of text, and both books have an unrealistic assumption about how quickly a dictator can rise to power and dismantle democracy. I don't agree with either one, with how quickly the United States becomes a dictatorship. So, by the way, um, Buzz Windrip, the dictator in It Can't Happen Here, is a homegrown American fascist, whereas Joe Steele is Joseph Stalin, is an alternate history novel where what if Joseph Stalin was born in the United States and rose to be and went on to become president. Now, Joe Steele, what would Joseph Stalin be without communism, you might ask? I was curious about that too. The closest thing I could compare Joe Steele to, because another booktuber called the United States a banana republic, the United States descends to a banana republic. I would compare Joe Steele to a sub-Saharan African dictator, an iron-fisted president or iron-fisted head of state that does not have a consistent, clear ideology. And this story goes on through the Great Depression, World War II, and the early days of the Cold War. Meanwhile, this one was the 1930s, the rise, the Great Depression, and the rise of fascism. This book takes place over a period of 3 to 4 years, while this one takes place over a period of a little over 20 years. So yeah, and so there's that. Joe Steele is easy reading. It's entertaining. It's political satire. It's an allegory to Joseph Stalin. There were some lines in there that I found humorous, and it was very cartoonish and unrealistic, implausible, the story, but it was fun nevertheless. It was an entertaining read, like an airport novel. It Can't Happen Here has much more to much more political philosophy to chew on. So Doremus Jessup is a journalist who at first is very out of touch with the people in his community. He writes newspaper articles, and he sometimes doesn't understand the lack of enthusiasm or the lack of interest in learning about the world. He notices his neighbor Shad Ledoux is rather an ignorant fool, and he wonders why is that so? I don't understand why he's not studying up on his politics, and why would he support this fascist monster, Buzz Windrip? So at first he's very out of touch, and he just writes newspaper articles, and he's indifferent. And he doesn't like the direction the country is going in. But he plays along, he tries to lay low for a while, but once his son-in-law is murdered, he enters political activism and is put in a prison camp and tortured. Which also happens to one of the two journalists in Joe Steele, which is told from the perspective of the Sullivan brothers. One of the Sullivan brothers becomes an aide or a public relations person to Joe Steele, while the other one becomes a vocal opponent, and he too enters a prison camp. So there's another theme there's another plot beat that I should have noticed. And Anyway, so, and the endings, Joe Steele has a very pessimistic ending, whereas It Can't Happen Here has a very optimistic ending, but still on something of a cliffhanger. And yeah, I think that's all there is to it, to this book, to this comparison video. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.